Churches have been occupied. Churches have been destroyed. Churches have been burned. Priests have been arrested. Homes have been searched. This means that the attack on the monasteries was just the peak of a widespread persecution of Christians in Ukraine. It's even worse. The Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which calls itself the Ukrainian Orthodox Church because it is a Ukrainian Orthodox Church, has now been banned by the Kyiv regime. Since 2014, persecution has intensified as part of this overall racist and anti-church policy. It goes so far that even today, priests, abbots, and even bishops are being arrested on the street, dragged off into the military, and sent to the front.
Why don't we hear or read anything about this church conflict in Germany? Against the current, about the person. Hello and welcome to Against the Current. I present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep hidden. The relics from the Orthodox Kyiv Cave Monastery are being kept in Berlin-Charlottenburg. How they got there, that's a real thriller, a political thriller. It's a story about hatred and violence, about fascism in Ukraine, and about how the people have fought back. It's about intelligence agencies, Western influence, and the attempt to pull Ukraine, economically and politically, into the Western sphere. No one knows this story better than the priest of the Orthodox Church in Berlin-Charlottenburg, where the relics from Kyiv are kept. Hello, Andrei Sikojev.
Good day, Patrick Bob.
Father Andrei, what route did the relics take from Kyiv?
The story begins with a great tragedy, the terrorist attack in Bastion, an Ossetian town near Vladikavkaz, where, as you know, more than 350 people were murdered, most of them children, babies, toddlers, and school kids. That was in 2004. At that time, the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, through me and on my initiative, decided to launch one of its largest or perhaps the only major long-term aid project, a trauma therapy center for those people, for the families, and for the survivors. And we succeeded, thanks to the help of many citizens from Germany, with donations also coming from Australia and the United States, and with the support of then-Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, who provided us with an aircraft to deliver pediatric surgical instruments there. So, long story short, we've been active there since 2004, working together with priests and nuns, doctors, teachers, and therapists in a monastery in the North Caucasus. Over the years, of course, new friendships have formed, many relationships. And during one of my trips a few years ago, this was before the war in Ukraine, I was in Ossetia and visited a small church there, an old one from the Tsarist era that a friend of mine had rebuilt. It had been destroyed during Soviet times, like almost all the churches in Ossetia and across the North Caucasus, during the period of church persecution under Bolshevism. I went there because that's where my great-granduncle's grave is. He was a priest from the mid-19th century. And the church council that built that church included a member of the Olympic team, a judoka, a wrestler, one of the best-known athletes of his time. He and his circle of friends, young men, athletes, Orthodox Christians from Chechnya, during the Maidan coup revolution in 2014, the most recent one, though there had been others before, starting back in 2004. From that point on, these young men, fearless fighters but really just athletes, young entrepreneurs and workers, were invited by the abbot of the Catherine Monastery to protect the monastery.
Why did it have to be protected?
We have to remember that the beginnings of the Maidan were rooted in a legitimate popular anger among Ukrainians, an uprising against corruption and the oligarchs, The Maidan wasn't just a protest movement controlled from the outside. It also had real roots among the people and reflected the Ukrainians' rightful demand for justice. But of course, it was exploited very early on. We've seen these patterns before in other countries, the Rose Revolution, the Orange Revolution, and all the others that followed. And it was also accompanied, at times, by right-wing terror groups, neo-Nazis, racists, and nationalists from Ukraine. Back then, they were still marginal, but they already had a strong influence on the atmosphere that prevailed there. And of course, they went after everything that had the word Russian in its name, whether it was a Ukrainian monastery, a church, or any other cultural institution. They harassed them, attacked them, and in some cases, even physically threatened them to the extreme. That means the Kyiv Lavra, the monastery here in Kyiv, was always right at the center of danger. It had to be sealed off and protected. And that's what those young men did. Of course, there were also men and young people from Kyiv involved, but they were professionals, experienced in de-escalation, unafraid, and they knew how to handle situations like that. They did this for years. They protected the monks, they protected the saints and the churches, and they risked their own health and their lives, and not just once.
Why were these relics so important? Why did they have to be protected?
These relics are the physical remains that come from the bodies of saints who, for almost 1,000 years, or at least since the very beginnings of Christianity in southern Russia or the South Slavic regions, meaning around Kyiv, carried the Christian faith, culture, education, and Orthodox civilization that came from the mission out of Constantinople. They lived that faith and formed the spiritual, intellectual, biographical, and historical foundation of Orthodox Christianity in Kievan Rus. The Kyiv Pechursk Lavra is now, today, one of the greatest sanctuaries in Ukraine. And because of that, it carries immense significance, not only from an art, historical, or architectural point of view, but also in terms of education, literature, language, and ethics. These relics are deeply honored and valued by the people, because through their faith, through the prayers of these saints, countless miracles and healings are said to happen. For the people, these saints are alive. And that's not magic. It's truly part of their culture and their religious life.
The monastery in Kyiv was under pressure from far-right anti-Russian groups. It was protected by young men from Ossetia, and then the relics ended up in Ossetia. How did that happen?
As a gesture of gratitude for all those years of protection, for the risks the people of Ossetia took, the relics were given to them and brought to Ossetia. And there, in turn, they were given to us, as thanks for our work in Ossetia, for what we did there for the people, together with the local community. That's how the relics, which were once rescued and handed over in Kyiv, eventually made their way to Berlin, and are now part of our church in Berlin-Charlottenburg.
And you can see them there.
You can see them there, and they're on display for veneration.
What's interesting is that the monastery was under pressure. Has there been increased pressure on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Ukraine since the Orange Revolution in 2004, especially since the coup on the Maidan?
Well, it's much worse. It's much worse. The Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which is called the Ukrainian Orthodox Church because it is a Ukrainian Orthodox Church, has now been officially banned by the Kyiv regime. Since 2014, there's been increasing persecution as part of this whole racist and anti-church policy of the new rulers. This has gone as far as harassment of the church, the closing of churches, the arrest of priests, the arrest of bishops, and even the arrest and imprisonment of the abbot of the monastery. The brotherhood was expropriated, and the monastery was taken away.
Das Kloster wurde enteignet. Es ist heute dem Kulturministerium unterstellt.
Today, it's under the authority of the Ministry of Culture, under the Kyiv government. And because of that, the persecution hasn't just intensified, it's reached an absolute peak in the most brutal way imaginable. It goes as far as priests, abbots, even bishops being arrested on the street, then dragged off into the military or sent to the front. And this keeps happening. Those are just a few examples. There are many more, and of course, the whole country is suffering because of it.
Darunter leidet natürlich das ganze Land.
And the Kyiv-Peschersk Lavra isn't the only monastery under pressure. I'm also thinking of the monastery in Sviatohirsk, right? What happened there?
Was ist da passiert? Das Sviatogorska Kloster ist eine Lavra, das heißt ein Großkloster.
The Sviatohirsk Monastery is a lavra, meaning a major monastery, and like the Kyiv-Peschersk Lavra, it's one of the country's most important holy sites. It's located in the east, in the Kharkiv region, and from the very beginning it's been right near the front line. The people there are, of course, culturally and linguistically connected to Russian culture and to the Russian Orthodox tradition. All the monks there are Ukrainians. About 3 years ago, the abbot, Metropolitan Arseny, was simply arrested and kept in solitary confinement, in pretrial detention, under conditions of torture, until quite recently. There was no meaningful charge against him. He was simply slandered.
Das Kloster steht unter Beschuss, und zwar
The monastery is under attack, physically, in the media, and even militarily. And it's not coming from the Russian side, as the monks themselves can confirm. What you see there really captures the whole tragedy and absurdity of the situation in Ukraine. Just imagine, the monastery had become a refuge for hundreds of displaced people. When the civil war in Donbass began, the monks took in almost 600 refugees. The elderly, the sick, women, children. They even organized entire schools there. Hundreds of people, 6, 7, 800, lived in the underground chambers and monastic cells, cared for by a monastery that was itself completely cut off from supplies. No pilgrims could come anymore because of the war and the conditions on the ground.
So how did the Sviatohirsk Monastery come under fire?
Nun, es ist einfach sehr frontnah. Also die Frontlinie.
Well, it's really very close to the front. The front line today runs right along the monastery. That means we're talking about the towns of Sviatohirsk and Krasny Lyman, which are nearby. And this has been the situation for years now. The front is relatively stable. It does shift, of course, but only by a few kilometers. So the line of war, the front line,
So an Orthodox monastery located in Ukrainian territory.
Yes, it's a Ukrainian monastery of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church located on Ukrainian territory.
And then when the Russians invaded, the front line rolled right over the monastery and then back again when the Russians pulled out of the Kharkiv region. What happened at the monastery after that?
As I just described, we had a situation there where hundreds, even hundreds upon hundreds of refugees were living. And not just for a day or a month, it was in effect a refugee camp. And even there, people shared what little they had. That means people in Ukraine from different regions started providing support, and we also got involved. One day, a group of pilgrims, traveling in 3 buses, actually made it through, but they were stopped at military checkpoints. Their IDs were checked, and so on. And when the first bus arrived at the church, at the monastery, during the service, Metropolitan Arseny called on the faithful. Just imagine a huge church completely full, to pray for those still sitting in the buses who hadn't made it through yet, so close to the front line. There was constant shelling to the right and left, and then an explosion. And the fact that he spoke publicly, in front of everyone, about a checkpoint was taken as military treason. He was arrested that same week and thrown into prison.
How's he doing today?
He's very, very seriously ill. Even before all this, because of the strain he was under, he wasn't exactly a healthy person, even though he's still relatively young. And the solitary confinement, the prisons, the unheated cells, the transfers, the stress, the interrogations, all of that has made him severely heartsick. For years, people have tried to help him, including efforts from Germany and from the international public, as well as journalists who brought his story to light. All of that eventually led to members of Congress, Orthodox Christians in the United States, taking up his case and bringing it before the new Congress after the change in government. And thanks to the influence of those members of Congress from the United States, it was possible to at least get him out of his prison cell and make sure he received medical care that had been denied to him. He's now under house arrest. He's wearing an ankle monitor, so he's still in custody. He hasn't been released or acquitted, but thankfully, he was saved through heart surgery.
The Kyiv Pechursk Lavra and the monastery in Siogorsk have been under pressure for quite some time, since 2014. So it's been clear for a long time that there's a struggle going on in Ukraine against the Orthodox Church. When did that struggle actually begin?
Well, that started a long time ago. It's of course historically rooted. It has to do with Ukrainian history, with the borderlands of Ukraine, and also with the influences of the Austro-Hungarian rule. But now, it's about the modern era.
Those were Catholics, of course, and the other part of the country was mostly Orthodox.
Correct. That means these lines of conflict are of course old, but they never had this kind of violent and anti-religious component that we're seeing now. After the Maidan, after the new regime was established, the Russian language was immediately banned as an official language in schools, in government offices, and so on. And then, during the civil war in the Donbass, or rather, during the regime's attack on the population in the east, we saw the whole situation escalate even further. And as part of this broader cultural struggle, the conflict expanded into a battle over religion. In other words, they simply declared that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is formally connected to the Moscow Patriarchate, that means it belongs to the Patriarchate of Moscow. So it's basically a branch of Russian intelligence, an influence agent, if you want to put it that way. And then they started to very deliberately target the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. They began pushing people to switch over to the state church, a branch of what's essentially a state-organized anti-church. Churches were occupied, churches were destroyed, churches were burned, priests were arrested, homes were searched. So this attack on the monasteries was really just the peak of a widespread, let's say, persecution of Christians in Ukraine, carried out under the pretext, especially in 2022, of the war against Russia.
President Poroshenko, who took office in May 2014, initially established his own Orthodox Church under Ukrainian state supervision, essentially to cut all ties with Russia. And now the Orthodox Church has even been banned. What does that mean for the believers?
You can't really say it in simple terms, because most people in Ukraine, those who go to church, who are active, who live their daily lives in Christian communities or schools, aren't interested in any kind of church conflict. They just want to live peacefully, including in their religious life. But that's over now. What's happening is that congregations that aren't willing to adapt to or join this state church are coming under enormous pressure. It starts with the priests who are being harassed. Then it continues with the congregations, which are attacked by groups of thugs trying to force changes in the community structure through violence. And it also happens quietly, behind the scenes. At the land registry office, property and ownership records are simply being changed and rewritten. And all the way to the west of Ukraine, Orthodox churches are being set on fire and destroyed after the occupation. Those churches now stand empty. Nobody goes there anymore, not to those so-called state priests. That means everyday life has become extremely harsh. I just heard another story that even bishops can no longer freely enter their own churches because they're of conscription age and get picked up by the local draft offices. In other words, where there's no church, there are no priests. And if the church is banned, it simply doesn't exist. What's being ignored is that these are people who have sons, fathers, or brothers fighting at the front for this very state, whether one likes it or not.
We're getting videos from observers, cell phone footage, showing Ukrainian Nazis stopping elderly women on their way to church and beating them.
Yes, it's still going on. They're bringing in gangs from other cities by bus, storming these churches with tear gas and clubs. And of course, it's mostly the women who resist, both older and younger, because the young men are immediately identified or arrested. So it's the women who are mainly there. I know of churches where people stayed inside for days, even weeks, to protect their buildings or the monasteries. The courage of many Orthodox Ukrainian believers remains unbroken. People are trying to adapt. That's clear. They've tried to find some kind of compromise. I've heard that suddenly the Ukrainian language is being used in services, even against the will of the congregation. I don't want to judge whether that makes sense or not. But the regime, in any case, isn't impressed by such tactical moves at all.
The United Nations Human Rights Report already pointed out acts of violence against Orthodox Christians back in 2023. Is this a new inquisition?
Well, inclusion in Western Europe had different causes and took a different path. There, it was really about certain adjustments to Roman power. Here, it's about adapting to and integrating into state power. An atheist, racist, and corrupt mafia state is attacking the church because by its very nature, it's pagan, it's atheist, and because Orthodox believers, Christians in general, just don't fit into that worldview. And of course, the Orthodox Church is a cornerstone of the shared history between Russia and Ukraine. You simply can't separate the two.
A unifying element.
Well, you could say they're like Siamese twins, or just twins, or maybe brothers or siblings. But you could also say it's really one single historical figure, depending on how you look at it. Still, of course, this is an inseparable historical dimension that's being targeted and broken apart in this way. That won't succeed, I'm sure of that. But the suffering, the persecution, the terror, it's everywhere, on a small scale and on a large one. People are simply afraid.
Historians and researchers have seen documents suggesting that the American intelligence agency, the CIA, is fueling this war against the Orthodox Church. How much truth is there to that?
Well, under both administrations, and actually even before that, under various U.S. presidential governments, we saw influence structures from major American organizations that accompanied political and military actions. And that included financial influence as well. Not just from the CIA, which was probably taking the lead there, but also from foundations that poured huge amounts of money into getting the whole thing started. And that money didn't just go to Poroshenko. Unfortunately, it also went to Constantinople, to the Patriarchate there, and to the Patriarch himself, who was, let's say, partly pressured and partly bought off. It's hard to determine exactly, but in any case, he was supported with significant sums to establish a new church from the outside.
Neue Kirche von außen zu gründen. Das heißt, die Staatsgründung dieser Staatskirche durch
That means the founding of this state church by Poroshenko was informal church law, carried out through the Patriarchate of Constantinople. In this new state church, he gathered all kinds of people, refugees, heretical and schismatic bishops, half-criminals, people who had been laicized. So a colorful mix of individuals who probably wouldn't even get a parish post anywhere in Western Europe, but who were of course immediately established there. And in a large, populous country like Ukraine, there's obviously a lot of money involved. As a church, as a congregation, as a diocese, you can use those funds for charity, for building churches, for helping the poor. But you can also make yourself quite fat and rich. And that's exactly what these people are doing.
Is this about positioning Ukraine as a cultural stronghold against Russia?
Absolutely.
Auf jeden Fall. Also, was wir hier erleben, ist die Vollendung eines.
What we're seeing is really the completion of old ideas that have always been around, ideas that never completely disappeared, not even during the Soviet era. The goal was to build Ukraine as an anti-Russia, and that became a geopolitical interest, first for the Americans, and now for Western Europeans as well, with the European Union and NATO expansion as key examples. The aim was to create a maneuvering ground, a theater of war, which eventually did break out. In fact, the intention was to turn this area into a kind of gray zone, of course, also under the influence of major international corporations.
Natürlich auch unter dem Einfluss großer internationaler Konzerne.
Menschen aus dem Donbass haben
People from the Donbass have told me that the Americans are sending in religious groups, religious fanatics, Adventists, who pretend they just want to do missionary work among the population. But behind that, they say, is the intelligence service. How much truth is there to that?
aber dahinter
The
steht der Geheimdienst. Was ist da dran?
Der Einsatz oder die Einflutung von
The spread of these schismatic groups, including some from Protestant circles, has been known since the 1990s, since the time of Perestroika. Back then, all kinds of groups, from Scientology to the Jehovah's Witnesses, flooded into the traditionally Orthodox countries, whether in Ukraine, Belarus, or Moscow. That has since been stopped. But in Ukraine, things are now wide open again, and especially in the Donbass, which still doesn't have an established structure. It's still basically a war zone. These groups are naturally trying to gain a foothold again. Of course, they also have their place in Ukraine. And it doesn't surprise me at all that if they come from abroad, they're also mixed with other interest groups. I haven't heard anything specific about it, but when I see or hear this report now, I can easily believe it. I have absolutely no doubt that it could be true.
Kein Zweifel, dass das wahr sein kann.
Warum hören
Why don't we hear or read anything about this church conflict in Germany?
diesem Kirchenkampf nichts?
Das ist eine sehr, sehr, sehr gute Frage, wie auch die Fragen vorher.
That's a very, very good question, just like the ones before. It moves me deeply, and as a German, it affects me profoundly, because silence like that also means shared guilt. Shared guilt in the persecution of Christians, shared guilt in the destruction of churches. And when that happens with Germany's silence, when we once again stay quiet in the face of such crimes, it's twice as painful and twice as heavy to bear, because nothing can exist that must not exist. For me, it was a clear warning sign, like the writing on the wall, when, in 2022, former Chancellor Scholz stood in the Bundestag and declared, Ukraine, the symbol of Europe's democracy and freedom. From that moment on, it was obvious to me where things were heading, both in politics and in the media.
Als auch für die Medien.
Aber das passt
But that doesn't really fit with the repressions you just described, Father Andrei.
Nun,
Well, maybe not back then, maybe not in the original idea, but I do think a new narrative has been created here and a new reality has been spun. And we can see that happening, war, terror, not just in Ukraine, but also within our own society, as if it were normal reality. It's become normal to react to the persecution of Christians or the imprisonment of journalists and lawyers as if that were just the way things are. It's considered normal to fund a regime that, according to all available American, European, and other sources, is deeply corrupt. Billions that are missing here in Germany are being funneled over there. The German public isn't really aware that it's not just weapons being financed, but the entire state structure. The EU and Germany are paying for the whole administration, the politics of people who haven't been elected in a long time. And in that sense, the picture is being turned upside down. In Ukraine, that's now seen as normality, not German democracy.
Can we say that Germany has changed, from helping refugees to becoming a party to war, to now being an active supporter of human rights violations?
Absolutely. That's exactly right. I experienced it myself, and I was deeply impressed by the hospitality and helpfulness of the German people, and also by how the German authorities handled the arrival of the resettlers. There were, I have to say, very few war refugees among them. In my view, at most 5 to 10%. Most were people who were simply able to leave their situation. Officially, they were finally allowed to enter Germany, and that's why it was mainly women and children who came, unlike during the refugee wave in 2015 from the Arab world, when men weren't allowed to leave. The few who came crossed the rivers, the border rivers, or fled through the forests, sometimes under fire. And they were welcomed here in our country with open arms. People opened their homes and apartments. The local authorities adapted almost overnight to take them in. The churches, well, we saw it ourselves. We built a lot of support structures for refugees and helped them integrate, with translators, with simple aid programs, with housing. But that has changed. I think Berlin is probably the last federal state still running the refugee program and taking people in as openly as it did in 2022. All the other states, as far as I can tell, have scaled their programs back. And now exactly what you just mentioned is happening. Billions keep flowing into weapons, into the military, and into that state structure in Ukraine, and they disappear there. They vanish in the blood of Ukraine at the front. By now, we basically have a third army fighting on those front lines. We have hundreds of thousands of casualties, and we share responsibility for all those deaths. Because what we're pursuing isn't a peace policy anymore, it's simply an arms policy.
How do you experience that as a priest in Berlin-Charlottenburg? Do you see a connection between Germany's involvement in the war and censorship or repression at home?
At the start of the open war in Ukraine, in 2022, and let me remind you again, the war in the Donbass had been completely ignored for 8 years, along with its thousands upon thousands of civilian victims caused by the regime there. At the beginning, the ramped-up propaganda, and I didn't bring up that quote for nothing, immediately showed its effects in the media. If Ukraine stands for democracy and freedom, then the Russians are portrayed as dictatorship and the enemy. And that attitude spread here as well, from the churches to the schools, all the way into the kindergartens. The bullying reached even the kindergartens. Our children were bullied. The Russian students were publicly shamed. At our church, the windows were smashed in. And it definitely wasn't done by Ukrainian refugees, but by agitated Germans. Probably young people too. Of course, we reported it. We reached out to members of parliament, to politicians, and we also involved the police. And that led to something. It wasn't just our case, and it wasn't just the protest in Berlin. It made state-level politicians, members of parliament, journalists, and the public push back against it.
Und auch Journalisten und Öffentlichkeit sich dagegen gewehrt haben. Ich kann mich erinnern, dass Frau Baerbock nach einem halben oder dreiviertel
I remember that at some point, after about 6 or 9 months, Ms. Baerbock said something like, "This can't go on. We really need to bring things back to a more civil tone and try to preserve some peace at home." Apparently, things had gotten a bit out of hand, like during the so-called Kristallnacht. The international public had started paying attention too. There were reports in the United States, in France, especially when it affects institutions that have existed here in Germany for centuries, like the Orthodox Church, which is the third largest church. That came to an end.
Das hat aufgehört. Ja. Was nicht aufgehört hat, oder was ebenfalls aufgehört war, der Zugang.
What didn't stop, or what also stopped, was access to federal politics, to the members of parliament, to the Bundestag, and to the media. I remember, for example, during the NATO war in Georgia, in Ossetia in 2008, there was full cooperation with Bild and Springer. They reported objectively and actually adopted our view, our assessment of that external aggression. We gave interviews to the Süddeutsche Zeitung when Pussy Riot caused a scandal in Moscow by desecrating churches in a blasphemous way. Our position, our assessment, was reflected there as well.
Das wurde unsere Position, unsere Einschätzung aufgenommen.
Und das hat sich verändert.
Absolut, das ist vorbei.
Man bekommt auch
That's changed, and you don't really get a sense anymore of what people are feeling. On the ground, once I spent the night at the Melitopol Monastery. There was an icon painter there. He was painting the inside of the church. I asked him about his work, and he explained it to me. I wanted to do an interview with him, but he refused. He said, "I have relatives west of the Dnipro. If they find out I'm working here, they'll end up in prison." And then I spoke with another man at the monastery, over dinner, Pelmeni. He said, "I have relatives west of the Dnipro too. We still need to liberate them." So people there talk about liberation. You get the impression that the repression is coming from the Ukrainian side. How do you see that?
Gehen von der Seite der Ukrainer aus. Wie nehmen Sie das wahr?
Die Repressalien in der Ukraine.
Ja.
Ja, selbstverständlich.
The repressions in Ukraine? Yes, of course. These repressions don't just affect Orthodox Christians, their communities, or the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They affect everyone connected to Russian or Russian-speaking culture and to Russian culture in general. The removal of monuments to Pushkin, Dostoevsky, or Bulgakov isn't a coincidence. It's not just symbolic. It's being carried out on a deeper level. And these repressions across the country are everywhere. But we also have to keep in mind, when people talk about Ukraine or the Ukrainians, that there's really no single group like that. I'd say there are at least 5 or 6 different population groups, each with a very different political perspective.
Bevölkerungsgruppen mit ganz unterschiedlicher politischer, religiöser Ausrichtung. Ja, es gibt,
There are religious groups. There are absolute nationalist patriots, let's just call them that for now, without judging them right away. There are people who are completely indifferent, and there are war profiteers, both on a large and a small scale. The billions have to go somewhere. They don't just disappear, they trickle down. And the flow of money, the participation in those streams, keeps going. And then there are the people who suffer, who endure it, who have to stay silent. Or there are the believers who take action, who defend their churches.
die aktiv sind, die ihre Kirchen verteidigen.
Und das war für mich auch interessant.
And I also found it interesting that the Metropolitan of the Melitopol Monastery told me this. The believers west of the Dnipro, meaning in the Ukrainian part of the country, are under such pressure that we're actually helping people escape at night. Are you aware of that?
Wissen Sie darüber was?
Ja, das ist absolut richtig. Ja,
Yes, that's absolutely right. The pressure isn't just cultural or social, it's also hitting men especially hard because of the threat of forced conscription. And the reports I'm hearing from American military people, specialists, former soldiers, or ex-intelligence officers who speak out on credible online platforms, those reports are really disturbing. There are basically 2 kinds of soldiers, or conscripted officers. On the one hand, you have the professionals, the ones who are properly trained and equipped. And then there's the majority, the ones who get called up quickly, receive only brief training, and are then sent straight to the front lines. Sent there to be burned out, quite literally.
Verheizt werden. Verheizt im wahrsten Sinne des Wortes, ja.
And when people are being used up like that, when Orthodox Christians come under so much pressure that they leave Ukraine, heading toward Russia, by the way, the country that's taken in the most refugees, how can anyone say that Western values are being defended there?
Nun, das kann man natürlich sagen, das macht es aber nicht wahrer.
Well, you can say that, of course, but that doesn't make it any truer. And that's why I quoted Scholz again. Freedom and democracy are now being defended in Ukraine. That's a reversal of meaning. That's newspeak. It's mass suggestion, mass language, mass formation, as the Swiss psychologist called it. Hannah Arendt already analyzed this. Narratives are being planted and then passed on to large parts of the population, though not to everyone. If you look at the period of National Socialism from 1933 to 1944, the picture in Germany looks almost the same.
1933 bis 1945 ist das Bild in Deutschland fast ähnlich. Wir dürfen uns da keine Illusionen machen.
We shouldn't fool ourselves about this. The Nazi regime under Hitler had the active support of at most about 30% of the population. The real problem was the silent majority. But that was only about a third as well. There was another third, maybe a quarter, some say 25, some say 30%, who were actually opposed in one way or another and took part in resistance. There's even a whole culture of jokes from that time. People got involved through Catholic parishes, through the churches, through youth movements. There's an enormous amount of research on this topic.
Unheimlich viele auch Forschung zu diesem Thema.
When we come back to Ukraine and see how Orthodox Christians there are being actively persecuted, and when we set aside the Western fairy tales for a moment, Ukraine today is a pro-fascist military dictatorship.
Der Begriff ist auf jeden Fall zutreffend. Ja. Man könnte ihn noch feinschleifen, man könnte es genauer analysieren.
Bitte.
Man könnte versuchen zu sagen, man schaut sich das von der ökonomischen und finanziellen Seite an. Ja, dann ist es eine Proxy-Regierung, ja, von Geheimdiensten und Großkonzernen etabliert. Ja, und die ist auch nicht mehr gewählt. Ja. Es ist auf ideologisch und religionshistorisch gesprochen. Es ist eine atheistische, eine heidnische Regierung, eine satanistische Regierung, die faktisch Geld gegen Blut bezahlt. Ja, ein russischer Religionsphilosoph.
A Russian religious philosopher in America once described it as a kind of bioreactor, a satanic bioreactor that's been set up there, fueled by billions coming from NATO and the EU, paid for in blood. What are the Ukrainians contributing? The Ukrainian regime provides the men. They even have supporters here in Germany who say, yes, young men have to go back, and they're setting up systems to send them back to the front. Western European politicians are calling for the draft age to be lowered to 18. And now there's even talk about sending women to the front. That's all part of it.
Is money in Ukraine being washed with blood?
So würde ich das formulieren. Es wird einfach nicht gewaschen, sondern gehandelt. Ja.
That's how I'd put it. It's not about washing hands. It's about making deals, trading human lives for money. And militarily, it makes no sense at all. I don't know a single Western military expert, whether from Germany, the US, or Switzerland, who still says this war can be won militarily. There's just nothing left to win. And yet, the war goes on. Why? What's the goal? That's a very good question, one of many good questions today. I've asked myself that for a long time, because I don't believe that the level of stupidity in European politics, with some exceptions, of course, is really so high that anyone seriously thinks a war by Germany, France, or Italy against Russia could be realistic.
Der Deutschen oder der Franzosen oder Italiener gegen Russland glaubt. Ich sehe das nicht, und das ist einfach auch nicht realistisch.
I don't see it that way. And honestly, it's just not realistic to think that any German or Western European troops, I just don't see that happening. I don't believe that Pistorius or Merz actually want to lead their armies into Russia. So what's really going on here? A good clue came from a former British finance minister, his name escapes me at the moment, in an interview with a British political journalist and scholar. He described it like this. Back in 2008, during the global financial crisis, solutions were put in place that he didn't agree with.
Lösungen aufgebaut worden sind, mit der er nicht einverstanden war. Sein Land wurde zerstört, Griechenland. Aber
His country was destroyed, Greece. But we remember that afterward, the European Union released enormous amounts of funding, funds meant for Western European corporations, for the big companies, as credit resources for technology investments. And he describes this as an expert. He knew the German politicians and financial policymakers who were involved, and he points out that this money wasn't actually drawn down by German industry, for example. And when it was used for quantitative expansion or financial transactions, but not for technology, not for AI, not for any of those processes.
in KI, in all diese Prozesse. Das heißt, da begann der Abriss.
That means that's when the dismantling began, or rather when the dismantling of the Western European pillars of German technological development, the very thing your guests from industry talk about, really took hold. At the same time, China is rising, Russia is rising, India, Iran, all of that is happening in parallel, and Germany is losing its market. Then comes the energy crisis, Nord Stream 2, all those stories we already know. So what now? What can Germany still do? And the decision is made to invest in armaments, to take the easiest path.
In die Rüstung zu investieren, den einfachsten Weg zu gehen. Ja?
The arms industry is supposed to stop deindustrialization.
Genau, die Rüstung soll das aufhalten oder das ersetzen, was eben bei Mercedes oder VW oder bei Siemens verloren gegangen ist und für immer vielleicht verloren gegangen ist. Und man sieht, dass es wieder zu einem Modell
And you can see that we're moving back to a model that's not typically German, meaning not value creation through technology, through engineering expertise, through small and medium-sized businesses, but through taxes. Tax money is being pumped into the arms industry, just like it was pumped into vaccines before, in massive multi-billion amounts. And what does that lead to? Nothing. It has no real lasting effect. Now, if you're financing the arms industry, and this is my explanation here, I'm expanding on what the Greek finance minister said, then you have to justify it somehow. You can't just build tanks and say, we're going to the moon. That doesn't work. You can't turn them into spaceships, so you have to send them somewhere, to fight a war. And the enemy is Russia. The enemy of democracy and freedom is Russia. That was already established. Putin as the new Hitler, the Russian Patriarch as the enemy of the Church, and so on, and so on.
Dass Russland der Feind ist, das ist aber nicht nur
That Russia is the enemy. That's not just part of the propaganda, it's clearly part of the strategy too. You know the region well, Ossetia, the Caucasus. We just had elections in Armenia. Pashinyan, the pro-Western president, got about 49%. A delegation led by Ursula von der Leyen and President Macron was in Yerevan beforehand. What's the point of that? Are they trying to open up new markets? Or is the goal to hit Russia strategically along the Caucasus flank?
geostrategisch an der Kaukasusflanke erwischen.
Ja. Die Brücke dazu ist vielleicht
And the bridge to that might be the conclusion of the topic we discussed earlier. Because a policy of rearmament like this naturally requires justification, or if you will, marketing and propaganda. That's where these war narratives come in. That's also where the propaganda narratives we see today come from. And of course, that's tied to this kind of magical reality that the media helps create. You can see the same thing in what's called Germany's famous feminist or values-based foreign policy, or moral foreign policy, whichever term you prefer, which is now simply being continued in that same direction. These people just go where they see their opportunities.
How is this policy, for example, being received in Ossetia?
Well, it's basically seen for what it is. Another attempt to create new hotspots of conflict, new areas of risk, or new front lines. In my view, Armenia is going through the same tragedy that Ukraine went through 2015 or even 10 years ago, being built up as a new anti-Russia, only this time in the South Caucasus. And it's quite clear that this approach simply doesn't work. You can see that from Azerbaijan's economic and military successes, which even received Russia's tacit approval. That's because the demands Armenia is making under this extremely nationalist and at the same time unrealistic policy led by Pashinyan are no longer recognized by anyone. Even Russia, as Armenia's supposed protector, has said, "We're not going to risk the lives of our soldiers for a regime like that."
Das arme und schwache
Poor and weak Armenia has a strong trading partner, and that's Russia. Russia is Armenia's strongest trading partner. About 60% of its exports go directly to Russia, and 90% go to the countries of the Eurasian Customs Union. So what would Armenia want with the European Union? That could only lead to economic decline if Russia starts imposing tariffs.
Niedergang bringen, wenn Russland nun Zölle erhebt.
Völlig richtig. Also, ich bin kein Fachmann für
Exactly right. Now, I'm not an expert in this field, but the scientists and analysts I listen to, read, or study all say very clearly this is, so to speak, pardon the expression, the wet dream of a small elite, a small Armenian elite, dreaming of being protected either by the United States or, if that doesn't work out, by France and Germany. These are absurd geopolitical ideas that tend to resurface again and again among small nations in the Caucasus region.
Bei solchen kleinen Nationen immer wieder auch im Kaukasusbereich hochkommen. Erinnern Sie sich daran, dass Georgien noch vor der Revolution
You might remember that Georgia, even before the revolution, before the Bolshevik Revolution, before the coup in 1917, had aligned itself with Germany, with the German Empire. They actually formed a kind of state union with Germany and then immediately switched sides when Germany lost the war in 1918. Their delegation went to Moscow to get back into Trotsky's good graces. Fantasies like that, dreams like that, have probably happened many times throughout history.
in der Weltgeschichte passieren, das führt natürlich zu nichts. Das ist chancenlos.
That obviously leads nowhere. It doesn't stand a chance. So, what role does this so-called Zangezur corridor play? The one that's supposed to connect Azerbaijan on the Caspian Sea through Armenian territory with the Nakhchivan exclave, creating a link between Turkey, a NATO member, and the Caspian Sea. What's its role?
In my view, there are two aspects to this. First, on a tactical and short-term level, the Americans slowed down the British Mi-6 and England's military ambitions, so that was clearly an action directed against London. In the long run, strategically, it's also about Iran, about the northern axis and securing that campaign. And certainly it's also a move, or maybe a piece of the puzzle, aimed at China and the Silk Road axis. So those are, let's say, the aspects that even a non-expert or layperson can recognize there.
So it's not just about holding back Russia, but also Europe and China, and it's aimed at Iran as well. According to my research, Israeli special forces, including the Mossad, have secret bases in Azerbaijan.
Das ist klar. Aserbaidschan ist einer der Bündnispartner Israels, wobei das auch zwielichtig ist. Ja, also man weiß, dass eben auch False Flag Angriffe im vorigen Jahr gegen Aserbaidschan geflogen sind. Es wurden Raketen abgefangen, die auf aserbaidschanisches Gebiet runtergehen sollen, israelische Raketen. Das wurde dann gestoppt, also im Moment hört man da nichts mehr, aber Aserbaidschan, das darf man auch nicht vergessen, ist auch ein großer Handelspartner Russlands, ja, und zwar viel größer als Armenien. Die aserbaidschanischen Eliten sind...
The Azerbaijani elites are well established in Russia in major business sectors, and at the same time, many of Russia's oil exports, at least until recently, have gone through Azerbaijani channels. So the connections run both ways, and how this all plays out is still open.
Und wie das Spiel ausgeht, ist eben offen.
Sie haben als Seelsorger
As a pastor, you work with Orthodox believers not only here in Berlin. You travel a lot, to Russia, to the Caucasus, to Assatia. What do you say to your parishioners who are worried about the endless wars in this world?
Die endlosen Kriege in dieser Welt.
Also zum einen kann ich Ihnen versichern, dass dieser Krieg...
First of all, I can assure you that this war, or any war really, is seen by everyone, whether in Germany or in Russia, as something dark, as a tragedy. No one, and I mean no one, thinks war is a good thing. War is truly the greatest misfortune that can befall people, especially for those nations that suffer real, concrete losses. It's a tragedy. And it's not just the 100,000 Ukrainians who've been killed. There are also the families they've left behind, the people we live with and interact with every day. These are people who have relatives over there, who are going through all of this, and the same is true in Russia. The Russians have victims too, and many of them.
Die Russen haben auch Opfer, und zwar auch viele. Und ein kleines Volk wie Ossetien, welches immer sehr patriotisch
And a small people like the Ossetians, who have always been very patriotic and very pro-Russian, who even back in the Tsarist era provided elite military units, cavalry forces that reached all the way to Berlin, and special divisions they formed themselves. Of course, they've also suffered heavy losses. That pain is real. People are living through it, and they're hoping for peace. But depending on where and how they live, they're not willing to accept what you might call rotten compromises. They simply know how to tell right from wrong. They understand who the aggressor is and who the victim is. They know who's involved and who benefits. And it's not just that. They're also very critical of their own elites in Russia.
Die sehen das auch sehr kritisch zu ihren eigenen Eliten in Russland. Ja?
Sagen Sie, die
Tell me, the believers who come to you, is there also a divide among them because of the war in Ukraine? Or is there a way for the church to start building bridges again?
Natürlich. Die Kirche ist der Ort des Friedens und ist der Ort, wo
Of
die
course.
Menschen versammeln.
The church is a place of peace, and it's where people come together, not only to pray for peace, but to create it. That happens among people across all kinds of different groups and national backgrounds, and through active help for those in need and for refugees. Refugees who come here to Germany, refugees in Ukraine, and also by standing with the people, the wounded and the dead in Russia. All of that is really happening. It's being lived out in practice. Everyone experiences that emotionally. There are cracks, yes, but they're not fundamental.
Ja, die sind aber nicht grundsätzlich. Ja, es ist ein Unterschied, ob seine Mutter
There's a difference between someone whose mother lives in Kyiv and has heard the air raid sirens at night, and someone who's lived here in Russia for decades in peace and quiet. There are people from Donbass who went through 8 years of war before the fighting spread into the rest of Ukraine. There are people who've never had anything to do with it. And there are friends who live in Crimea and have lost family members to missile strikes. Everyone experiences this war differently, of course. The level of empathy varies. In the parishes, and that's something I've personally made sure of, political discussions don't take place inside the church itself.
Im reinen Kirchenraum nicht diskutiert. Nicht, weil das nicht die Leute eine Meinung haben, sondern weil
Not because people don't hold those opinions, but because emotions, fears, and maybe even anger start to take over the dialogue, or even over the prayer. So the idea, or rather the strategy here, is to allow certain kinds of language, the language of prayer, the language of help and compassion, but to leave out the language of political structures or politicians, because that's usually shaped by the media, or it's dishonest, or simply inadequate, and it doesn't really reach the other person. You mentioned earlier the term liberation of certain areas. The Ukrainians use the word occupation. If you put two people with those perspectives together, you immediately have a conflict, and usually not a constructive one.
haben sie sofort einen Konflikt, der in der Regel nicht konstruktiv ist.
Auch durch die orthodoxe Kirche geht.
There's also a deep divide running through the Orthodox Church, says Andrei Sikojev, a priest of the Orthodox Church in Berlin-Charlottenburg. But he also says the church faith itself is a place of peace. He says the church in Ukraine, the Orthodox Church, is banned, it's under pressure, and that Ukraine today is a pro-fascist military dictatorship. Thank you for that. Here on Against the Current, we present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep hidden.
Perspektiven, welche die Propagandamedien verschweigen.